So I want to thank you all again for joining us for Audio Description, the Visual Made Verbal. Our speaker today is Dr. Joel Snyder, President and Director of Audio Description Associates. Dr. Snyder is known internationally as a pioneer in the field of audio description, making theater events, museum exhibits, and media accessible to people who are blind or vision impaired. He serves as the director of the American Council of the Blind's Audio Description Project. And so we are delighted to have Joel with us as today's speaker. So Joel, thank you for doing this webinar for us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sharon. And I am honored to be on the dais here, the virtual dais, if you will, with Sharon Spencer and IAAP. I am a founding member of IAAP, as many of you are, as I'm sure. But let's get right to it. Audio description, the visual made verbal. You may have access, I hope, to the first slide on my PowerPoint. Basically, it's text that has already been mentioned. At the bottom of the screen, though, it says American Audio Description Symbol. And right in the middle is a white square within which are two letters in bold black print, A and D. The left side of the A tilts a bit toward the right, and to the right of the D are three curved lines. I mention that because, you know, sometimes audio description is not just about access to the arts, it's access to anything that is visual and has importance wherever the visual image is employed. And when we make presentations, when professors in universities, they do a lot of work with universities, they need to learn, those professors need to learn to do self-description, if you will, and that doesn't mean, you know, I'm 6'5" tall and I have a head full of thick curly hair, which is not a description of me, but self-description meaning describe the images you're presenting, because you don't know who's in your audience that may be blind or may have low vision. And not only that, there may be folks in the back of the hall who can't quite see what you've got on the screen there. So self-description, description comes in handy for so many people, really, not just people who are actually members of that club of folks who are blind or have low vision. Those are the folks who are not light dependent, by the way, like all the rest of those folks who quote unquote see, but most of them don't observe, you know. They're dependent on light. So what's the disability here anyway? So I mentioned too that logo of audio description there, and I mentioned the three curved lines to the right. Beginning describers sometimes will make the mistake of adding, they represent sound waves. Well, that may very well be the case, but there's nothing there that says that explicitly for the sighted viewer. When you stop describing and start explaining, you've gone over the line. At best, it's annoying. At worst, it's patronizing. Why wouldn't a person who's blind know what three curved lines represent? They grow up in the world and they encounter images and ideas just as much as anyone else. Anyway, what better way to begin our work together on description than with description of two visual images, cartoons actually. I'm going to click to one of them here. There it is. Good, good. The caption at the top says opera description. And I dare say the title on some of this in this cartoon here is pretty darn small. Some of you sighted people may need audio description. That's just as well, because you're going to get some. The Fan by John McPherson. On a stage, at left, a woman in a flowing gown, her hands clasped in front of her, stands before a kneeling man in a doublet and feathered cap. He croons, "Why doth thy heart turn away from mine?" At right, a man at a microphone speaks. Basically, the guy with the goofy hat is ticked because this babe has been running around with a dude in the black tights. The caption reads, Many opera companies now provide interpreters for the culturally impaired. And indeed, some of that type is probably not legible to people who are sighted. The description makes it available to them. And indeed, what is that on the top of that guy's hat that he's on bended knee there? And that's a doublet, a feather. You can't tell from the picture, can you? But hearing the description, you learn a little something, even though you don't technically need it to have access to the picture. Another cartoon. I'm going to mention how cartoons are relevant to this in a little bit. Here you go, Red and Rover by Brian Bassett. In the first panel, Red, a red-haired 8-year-old boy, is outdoors lying on the ground against a tree, facing away from us, and his right arm is around Rover, a white, short-haired dog, a lab beagle mix. A leaf falls. Red announces, "Brown." In the next panel, as Rover's tail taps, Red notes, "Orange." Oh, red, yellow. In the following panel, red, orange, yellow, yellow. Next, Red turns toward us, eyes wide, and tells us, "Dogs only see in black and white." The final panel depicts a more full view of the tree, leaves scattered about the pair as Red continues, "Yellow, orange, brown, red, orange." There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Audio description for dogs. There, you saw it here first. Colorblind dogs. I think dogs are generally colorblind. They don't perceive red the way we do. So there you have it. One more even, actually perhaps highlighting this idea of color. Some folks I work with will say, well, that's fun and all, but people who are blind don't care about color. Why would people who are blind care about color? Well, folks that ask that question, I think, are making a mistake. They think of people who are blind as, first of all, totally blind, and second of all, congenitally blind from birth. Well, that's a small portion of the population that we serve. And even there, people who are congenitally blind, totally blind from birth, they grow up in the world. They talk to people. They know about color. And color is a part of our culture. They want to be a part of our culture. They know that red is not just a hue or a frequency of light. It's red is angry. Yellow is cowardly. Green, in the United States anyway, is money, and so on. And another cartoon, Brewster Rocket here, makes this quite clear. There's Brewster Rocket, the buff space guy, and he's thinking to himself. He has his hand to his chin. He says, "I've heard that we can see red and be purple with rage. Cowards can be yellow. We can be in the black or in a gray area, be green with envy, in the pink, and have the blues. But what does being orange mean?" One of his space colleagues walks by. He's got his hand in an open bag of Cheetos. He's got yellow Cheeto cheese, whatever, all over his shirt and his mouth. And he says, "It means I really, really like Cheetos." Brewster adds, "I doubt that saying will ever catch on." So there, color and people who are blind. Color means more than just a hue, if you will. A little bit, before we plunge into what makes good description, I think that's where I want to focus today. A little bit of history here. As I oftentimes say, description informally has been going on since the beginning of time. In fact, I think they've done some research and traced description back to prehistoric eras. I think there was a couple of guys, Og and his buddy. They were in a cave munching on some leftover saber-toothed tiger. Yeah, and suddenly Og looks up and he shouts to his buddy, "Oh my God, look, there's a mastodon coming from the left." Yeah, that he was a Jewish caveman, obviously. That is the first instance of audio description. It's not even for somebody who's blind. He's just looking the wrong way. Audio description is for folks who are looking the wrong way, They're not in the same room with you, or maybe you're in the kitchen making a sandwich while the television is on in the living room. You don't miss a beat because you can hear what you can't see. I promised to link those cartoons back to some history, and indeed there is some history with audio description and cartoons, at least the way I detail it in my book, The Visual Made Verbal, available at fine bookstores near you, or on Amazon.com, or through the American Council of the Blind. I've got a picture up here now, a black and white photograph of a somewhat heavy man seated at a desk. He's got a round face with horn-rimmed glasses, a shock of dark hair over his ample forehead. He's got a sheet of papers in his hands, a pen in his right hand, and to his left, a microphone with the letters WNYC. I don't know if any of you folks will remember who this fellow is or ever saw this picture before. Well, it's Fiorello LaGuardia, the much beloved mayor of New York City in the 1940s. And during his tenure, there was a newspaper strike. Yeah, and it was pretty distressing. It went on for quite some time. And Fiorello LaGuardia, the savvy mayor that he was, he didn't take the side of the workers. He didn't take the side of the publishers. No, he took the side of the people. And what were the people missing? His constituents, they were missing, first and foremost, their comics. That's the first thing you turn to when you get the newspaper in the morning, isn't that right? It is for me, especially Sunday mornings. So he went on the WNYC radio every Sunday morning, and he read the comics to the people of New York City. And, of course, very quickly he discovered I can't just read the text. I have to describe the images. So he is an early audio describer. Some people, speaking of politicians, some people talk of Ronald Reagan as being an early audio describer because, you know, he was a sports announcer early in his career, and oftentimes he would describe not even being at the game. He was getting a ticker tape that told him he's in Illinois and the game is in New York. He gets a ticker tape that tells him what's going on. He'll say base hit, pop-up fly, strike one, strike two. Well, he's getting that data and then embellishing it with description of images he can't even see because he's not at the game. But he's got sound effects, and just through his imagination, he's creating images that help his listeners see the game that at least he's painting for them. And another politician you may know, I'm going to flash an image up here of a politician reading an audio describer. Oh, I don't have that image. Oh, well, I thought I did, but I was going to have some fun there. I have an image of yours truly chatting with Barack Obama at the White House. I like to include that. He's a president that has had audio description available at his outdoor ceremonies. He, during his tenure, the American Council of the Blind and I developed the first ever audio described tour of the White House. And most importantly, well, you know, his inaugurals, I did the live description for both of them on ABC. And most importantly, though, he signed the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, which for the first time in the United States mandates by law that there be audio description with public television. It's not just public television, with commercial broadcasting. It's at a low rate right now, and we're working to try to increase that, catch up perhaps with Canada and the United Kingdom and such. But and finally, back to cartoons, though, just to kind of tie off that little circle. I began in this whole description thing with a small group that were pulled together to provide description for Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. in 1981. I was already a volunteer reader for the Washington Ear, a radio reading service for the blind and physically handicapped. And they'd been involved with helping Arena Stage become more accessible. Arena had just installed some assisted listening, and it became clear, you know, this could be used to provide description to people who are blind. You just use the same microphone, and instead of picking up the audio of the show and enhancing it, you speak into it and describe the images. And from there, the Washington Ear developed the world's first ongoing audio description service. So I was fortunate enough to already be there. And as I say, I was a reader for the ear, reading actually the Washington Post on Sundays. So I myself had to become a describer before there was such a thing, because I wanted to make those images accessible to people who were blind, who were listening to the Sunday Funnies. I do want to mention, though, that in California, right about the same time, in fact, a few years earlier, a fellow named Gregory Fraser really published the first paper that described, if you will, audio description. He was at San Francisco State University and later went on to develop San Francisco's audio description program called Audio Vision. A great guy and oftentimes overlooked, I think, in discussing the history of audio description. So now, 35 some years later, I've had the honor of helping folks in all kinds of genres on television and film and museums, in performing arts, and through my own company, Audio Description Associates, and also, as Sharon mentioned, the American Council of the Blind and I began about 8 years ago the Audio Description Project, which is just a wonderful, we have many different programs, and one of the most important, I think, is its resource, its website that makes available more information than anywhere else, I think, information on audio description. You might make note of that, acb.org/ADP, Audio Description Project. I'll mention that again. My own website is audiodescribe.com. But what is this thing we call audio description? I think of it as a literary art form. It's about words, you know. I'm holding my hands out to the sides. It's, you know, I'm going to narrow that a bit. It's actually a kind of poetry. He brings his hands in closer to each other. No, I'm going to narrow it even further. It's a haiku. His hands are almost touching. A haiku. Why do I say that? Well, it provides a verbal version of the visual. The visual is made verbal and oral. He points to his ear, A-U-R-A-L, and oral, O-R-A-L. He points to his mouth. Using words, again, as few words as possible, like a haiku, words that are succinct, vivid, imaginative, to convey that visual image that's not fully accessible to a segment of the population. And by the way, the American Foundation for the Blind puts that number at over 21 million Americans who are blind or have difficulty seeing even with correction. That's a significant audience right there. That's 8% of the population. They have family, they have friends. And of course, as I've mentioned, it's applicable for the rest of us where the visual image is not fully realized, you know. Sighted folks who see but who just don't observe. So, you know, let me help you see what description is all about by asking you figuratively to close your eyes. You don't actually have to close your eyes. I'm going to close them for you because you're on an audio medium here, and I'm going to play an audio clip for you. This is from a feature film, major feature film, played in the United States. I did the description for it, but I want you to experience just the segment of it as a totally blind person would. Just going to play the audio. Now, it's a feature film, though. That should be plenty for you to understand what's going on here. I think you'll enjoy it. It's called The Color of Paradise. Some of you may know it. Take a listen to this and see what you get out of it just listening to the original audio track. Wow, wasn't that great? That's one of my favorite movies. Wasn't that great? Just one of my favorite movies. I'm sure you all agree. You're all probably scratching your head. What the heck is going on there? And of course, people will say, let's see. There are some birds. Oh, birds. Good, good. That's right. Then, maybe there's some struggle going on. There's a woman. No, it's not a woman. It's a boy. I don't know what. People don't have a clue. And this is a major feature film. This was played in movie theaters. But most movies these days will have minutes that go by without any dialogue. And by the way, that was a couple of minutes long. Didn't it feel like it was about an hour and a half? I think we've used up our time, Sharon. It felt that way because you don't know what's going on. You lose interest. And that's what happens sometimes if a blind person doesn't have the information he needs that everybody else has, where everybody else has already gone, to clue in to elements of our culture. Let's see if description will help. Hopefully it will, and I think it did when this was created. Let's give it a try. Let's listen to the same clip, that same darn thing all over again. No image. Let's just listen to it with audio description. Does it help? Does it make the images clear for you? And then we'll talk about the description itself.
Muhammad kneels and taps his hands through the thick ground cover of brown, curled leaves. A scrawny nestling struggles on the ground near Muhammad's hand. His palm hovers above the baby bird. He lays his hand lightly over the tiny creature. Smiling, Muhammad curls his fingers around the chick and scoops it into his hands. He stands and strokes its nearly featherless head with a fingertip. Muhammad starts as the bird nips his finger. He taps his finger on the chick's gaping beak. He tilts his head back, then drops it forward. Muhammad tips the chick into his front shirt pocket. Wrapping his legs and arms around a tree trunk, Muhammad climbs. He latches onto a tangle of thin upper branches. His legs flail for a foothold. Muhammad stretches an arm between a fork in the trunk of the tree and wedges in his head and shoulder. His shoes slip on the rough bark. He wraps his legs around the lower trunk, then uses his arms to pull himself higher. He rises into thicker foliage and holds onto tangles of smaller branches. Gaining his footing, Muhammad stands upright and cocks his head to one side. An adult bird flies from a nearby branch. Muhammad extends his open hand. He touches a branch and runs his fingers over wide green leaves. He pats his hand down the length of the branch. His fingers trace the smooth bark of the upper branches, search the network of connecting tree limbs, and discover their joints. Above his head, Muhammad's fingers find a dense mass of woven twigs, a bird's nest. Smiling, he removes the chick from his shirt pocket and drops it gently into the nest beside another fledgling. He rubs the top of the chick's head with his index finger. Muhammad wiggles his finger like a worm and taps the chick's open beak. Smiling, he slowly lowers his hand.
Yeah. Hey, that was a lot quicker. How did that happen? Well, so hopefully that was a bit more clear. That clued you into the scene. And obviously, I oftentimes will pause at this point with my students and I'll ask them, this is a clip from the middle of the film so that Muhammad himself, his visage, who he is, would have already been described, what he looks like. But just from having listened carefully to the description, what else can you tell me about Muhammad? and people will talk about his empathy and his age perhaps, and he's agile. He can climb a tree, and he has shoes on, yeah, and a shirt too. We know that, right? They don't oftentimes get to much more than that. Just from having listened to the description of how Muhammad interacts with his environment, with the tree, can you tell me anything more? And they usually fumble around a bit, unless I have a couple of blind people in the audience, and they will immediately respond, he's blind, isn't he? Well, sure he is, because he interacts with his environment, and that's what the cinematographer shows us, him touching, his feeling, tapping down branches and such. And you'll see that now. And as you experience the film with the video, think about it a little bit. Did we describe everything that you would describe? Were there things that maybe you wouldn't have described that we described? Editing is a big part of description, choosing what you're going to describe, because description is so often about what not to include. There's so much that one sees, far too much than one can possibly mouth or voice in time allotted. So here you are again. I'll let you experience this a third time, Color of Paradise, with the video and with the audio description, augmenting the original soundtrack.
Muhammad kneels and taps his hands through the thick ground cover of brown curled leaves. A scrawny nestling struggles on the ground near Muhammad's hand. His palm hovers above the baby bird. He lays his hand lightly over the tiny creature. Smiling, Muhammad curls his fingers around the chick and scoops it into his hands. He stands and strokes its nearly featherless head with a fingertip. Muhammad starts as the bird nips his finger. He taps his finger on the chick's gaping beak. He tilts his head back, then drops it forward. Muhammad tips the chick into his front shirt pocket. Wrapping his legs and arms around a tree trunk, Muhammad climbs. He latches onto a tangle of thin upper branches. His legs flail for a foothold. Muhammad stretches an arm between a fork in the trunk of the tree and wedges in his head and shoulder. His shoes slip on the rough bark. He wraps his legs around the lower trunk, then uses his arms to pull himself higher. He rises into thicker foliage and holds onto tangles of smaller branches. Gaining his footing, Muhammad stands upright and cocks his head to one side. An adult bird flies from a nearby branch. Muhammad extends his open hand. He touches a branch and runs his fingers over wide green leaves. He pats his hand down the length of the branch. His fingers trace the smooth bark of the upper branches, search the network of connecting tree limbs, and discover their joints. Above his head, Muhammad's fingers find a dense mass of woven twigs, a bird's nest. Smiling, he removes the chick from his shirt pocket and drops it gently into the nest beside another fledgling. He rubs the top of the chick's head with his index finger. Muhammad wiggles his finger like a worm and taps the chick's open beak. Smiling, he slowly lowers his hand.
And everybody goes with, awe, isn't that something? Yeah. And let me just, not to belabor this particular point. I don't want to do that. I want to go back to the PowerPoint. That's what I want to do. Here we are, I think. What did I do, Sharon? There it is. Okay. Let me go back to the PowerPoint here. I want to show you what I've done is given you here the audio description script for that excerpt, and I've annotated it with a few points that I think may be helpful. The very first line, Muhammad kneels and taps his hands through the thick ground cover of brown, curled leaves. Well, color has been shown to be important to people with low vision, even people who are congenitally blind, as we discussed earlier. And of course, brown, curled leaves, without being able to see it, you know it's fall, it's autumn time. Sure. The second note is actually at a cue, at a point, some of the sounds that happen. There's no dialogue, but sound, the gasp, the chirping. Well, we have to time the description very carefully to weave it around a film's sound elements. It really becomes a part and parcel of the film so that it's not noticeable. Shouldn't stand out. Best compliment a describer can get was, I didn't even know you were there. I just saw everything, you know. Third note I have here, Muhammad curls his fingers around the chick and scoops it into his hands. Yeah, vivid verbs help conjure images in the mind's eye. He doesn't just pick it up. He doesn't grab it. He scoops it into his hands. Description is oftentimes about verbs. And about, well, speaking of verbs, here you go, a little bit later, he taps his finger on the chick's gaping beak. He tilts his head back, then drops it forward. Muhammad tips the chick into his front shirt pocket. Taps, tilts, tips. Description, like much poetry, is written to be heard. Alliteration adds variety and helps to maintain interest. Just a couple more. Yeah, I mentioned, you know, your editing. What are you going to include? We've got an adult bird flying from a nearby branch. Well, you've watched the whole clip. You've watched the whole movie. And you know, that image must be important. The adult bird returns in the next scene. It's almost a foreshadowing. And so you get a good sense of what to include by understanding the arc of the story, if you will, and moving on from there. And then finally, my next note is also about, oh, there's some more script. Here you go, specificity. He rubs the top of the chick's head with his index finger. Yeah, not his pinky, not his thumb, no, his index finger. Precision creates images. And finally, at the end, Muhammad wiggles his finger like a worm. Well, actually, there's no worm there, is there? There's no worm there. But by using your imagination and conjuring the image of a worm, of course, that's what Muhammad is doing, I feel confident, right? When you use your imagination to bring that out, you help paint a picture. It's a simile. Using similes sometimes can paint pictures. So there are some elements of description that I think are pretty important. You know, this deals with a blind child, and actually the last 10 years or so, I've done a fair bit of writing on audio description and literacy, how it develops, how audio description can aid in the development of understanding of language, not just for blind kids, but for any kid. I was recently at a conference on this very topic in Louisville, Kentucky, and talking a bit about that now here in Orlando. I'm speaking at the World Blind Union Assembly. This all came about when I was doing an audio-described tour for a children's museum in New Haven, Connecticut, and they had teachers there who worked with blind kids, and I worked with them a little bit. We experimented with developing more descriptive language to use when you're working with kids and picture books. Now, obviously, picture books rely on pictures to tell the story, but a teacher trained in audio description would never simply hold up a picture of a red ball and read the text, "see the ball," and turn the page. No. I think he or she might add, you know, that ball is red, just like a fire engine. I think that ball is as large as you are. It's as round as the sun, a bright red circle or sphere. Now, what has the teacher done with a couple lines of description? Introduced new vocabulary, invited comparisons, used metaphor or simile, with toddlers. So I think when you use audio description, you make a book like that or a short video accessible to children who have low vision or are blind, and you help develop more sophisticated language skills in all the kids who are listening. So you hear the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, that may be so. But the audio describer might say that a few well-chosen words can conjure vivid and lasting images. And indeed, speaking of children and audio description, I for 6 years, produced the description that was used for Sesame Street on PBS. And I remember getting a lovely letter from a blind parent of sighted children. And this woman was maybe 40 years old. She remembered listening to Sesame Street as a blind child and just loving the music and hearing the story and such. And that was great. But now she was moved to write to us because for the first time she could follow along with her kids the antics of Elmo and Bert and Ernie and all the other denizens of Sesame Street. We also provide the description for the Spanish version of Sesame Street, Plaza Sesamo, where Big Bird is green, believe it or not, and add description to Sesame Street's DVDs and such. So I can't go through all that without letting you in on a little bit of Sesame Street, a little bit of Elmo's World with audio description.
Elmo stands beside Dorothy's fishbowl.
Hi! This is Elmo's World! Oh, Elmo's so very happy to see you. Oh, and so is Dorothy. Say hello, Dorothy.
An orange goldfish.
Oh, guess what Elmo's thinking about today?
Elmo glances around himself.
Hear that? Yeah!
Elmo dances to a purple door and opens it. Outside, people and puppets sit on steps on Sesame Street. The doorway stretches wide.
Oh, thank you.
The people and puppets wave at Elmo. Elmo turns around.
Oh, Sesame Street.
Oscar pops up.
Get lost.
Oscar. You know Sesame Street.
Elmo and the others dance.
Yeah.
Now a bird puppet flies over Sesame Street. Alan dances with a broom. A man in ballet tights jumps up and down with letters. People and puppets bounce. 4 cartoon baby dragons appear. A man dressed in a big letter M dances on a beach. A bat puppet follows the count. Maria kisses Luis on the cheek. A blonde woman plays piano. A cartoon orange wears sunglasses. Grover the waiter drops dishes. Big Bird plays with children. Rosita dances with sheep puppets. A boy wears a red mask and yellow cape. Alpha Boy. Bird struts. Cartoon men dance. A bearded man dances with a cane. A woman plays guitar. Ernie holds a banana in his ear. Telly does an Egyptian dance. A woman claps while puppets sway. Zoe dances with a boy and girl. A man sits at a piano and squeezes a rubber ducky. A man plays an electric guitar. Gordon waves from a window. Cookie Monster hugs a doll. Now Dorothy swims by a small green lamppost in her bowl. A sign, Sesame Street.
Well, you know,
Dorothy's been thinking
let's
about
get into the
Sesame
meat
Street,
of this
too.
here, really. I have trained describers in, 35, 40 different states, and actually in 45 different countries. And what I want to do with you now in the final minutes remaining is just share with you what I found out about what it takes to offer description in ways that I think will be most useful. You know, as a kid, I was a great devotee of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his amazing detective, Sherlock Holmes. Well, brilliant and, yes, incredibly observant. So in developing description, I emphasize 4 elements, the first of which is all about that skill that Sherlock Holmes honed. And on the screen there, 4 fundamentals of audio description, the first of which is observation. I've got a quote there by the famous philosopher. You New Yorkers might know him, Yogi Berra. He said, "You can see a lot just by looking." That's so true, isn't it? An effective describer must increase his level of awareness and become an active seer, not prophet, but just one who sees. Develop a sense of visual literacy. Notice the visual world with a heightened sense of acuity and share those images. As John Ruskin said, we must seize what we see. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe said we should see with exactitude. And you know, nothing about us without us is the cry of disability activists. Well, indeed, here Helen Keller says the same thing so eloquently. Those who have never suffered impairment of sight or hearing seldom make the fullest use of these blessed faculties. Their eyes and ears take in all sights and sounds hazily, without concentration, and with little appreciation. Well, describers can't do that. No, describers must see all that there is to see. Take a look at this picture. You know, the quote on it here, the caption, 87% of people can't see what's wrong with this picture. Can you? And people stare at this for a while, and you know, it has a little something to do with what magicians call misdirection. Maybe they're focusing on the young woman's eyes, or the finger in her mouth, or those earrings, or the skimpy top she has on, something like that. Well, of course, if you're really looking at everything that's there, you will realize that she has 6 fingers. Most people don't see that. In the same way, do you really look when you see things that you have easy titles for, the names of? For instance, the logo for FedEx. You see this logo, and you go, yeah, okay, FedEx. That's the name of it. Next, you know, what is it? It's 5 letters, 3 blue, 2 orange. They're all right up against each other. So what? You know, they paid a lot of money for this logo. They did. They paid a graphic designer. What could possibly, now really look at it. Forget the name. Really look at it. What is that between the E and the X? Sure, it's an arrow that points to the right. FedEx moves. FedEx delivers. And that arrow is kind of famous among logo designers and logo historians, if there is such a thing. Indeed, Paul Valery said, seeing is forgetting the name of what one sees. Okay, you've got a name, you've got a title. That's not a description. You've got to really see something to do a description. Here's another quick little awareness test. Those of you that spend a lot of time on the web have probably experienced this one, but it's kind of fun, I think. Let me get this fired up here, and I will get my phone muted as well. Here you go.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
Following him from right to left, it's easy to miss something you're not looking for. Look out for cyclists. That was an ad for the City of London. Yeah, again, misdirection perhaps, but were you looking? Could you see that bear? Was difficult to see. They do that purposely, moving from right to left there. Yeah, you need to see everything. And sometimes when there's more time, I show a couple of clips from Sherlock Holmes videos that really recount the origins of Sherlock Holmes and the character, a doctor, a medical doctor, Arthur Conan Doyle was a medical doctor, and he patterned the character of Sherlock Holmes on one of his professors who could diagnose by truly looking at a patient, thinking, listening. Not too many doctors do that these days because we have tests, right? So anyway, you're going to see everything, but then you're not going to use it. No, not most of it. Description is about what not to describe. Indeed, you're going to probably, well, you very definitely will need to edit out from what you've got there that you've seen on screen or on a stage or wherever it may be. You need to edit. And there's the next slide, editing. You ask yourself, what is most critical to an understanding, he points to his head, and an appreciation of the visual image. Appreciation, his hand is on his heart. Art and description is about carving out what's most meaningful. Oliver Wendell Holmes, of all people, said the great struggle of art is to leave out all but the essential. Georgia O'Keeffe, an artist, of course, a great Western American artist, only by selection, by elimination, by emphasis can we get at the real meaning of things. So you actually help people see by giving them less. And let me demonstrate that perhaps with this photo of Tiger Woods. It's an ad actually for Accenture. Color photo of Tiger Woods crouching, squatting on the green. He's got his putter leaning against his left shoulder. He's got his hands cupped over the brim of his cap, folded down around the sides of his face. What's he doing, of course? He's lining up a shot because he wants to make the putt. But what he's actually doing is focusing. He wants to see less. He doesn't want to be distracted by anything else than what will help him succeed, make the putt. To accomplish more, sometimes you need to see less. And I think that's the effect that that good audio description and good editing of what you see has. You make choices, and you make them based on an understanding of blindness and low vision. Go from the general to the specific. Use color. Include directional information. Most of our folks can see if you tell them where to look, and so on. And most of all, perhaps, developing a literacy of the particular art form or whatever it is you're describing. What's being conveyed by the director or the cinematographer. Finally, not finally, but third most anyway, this is where we're going to spend the most time in learning how to describe. That's with language, words. We transfer it all to words. Objective, vivid, specific, and imaginatively drawn words, phrases, and metaphors. Less is more, always remembering less is more. I'll ask my students, take a look at this picture of the Washington Monument. Now, if you wanted to describe that, in particular, if you wanted to emphasize its height, looking at this picture, what would you say? And some people, they think they're going to trick me or whatever because they happen to know that the Washington Monument is 555 feet tall. And they'll say that. Well, there you go, 555 feet. Well, that's accurate, but is it vivid? Is it imaginative? Does it convey the image? What's the shape here, And speaking of the height, look at those flagpoles around. A flagpole, is a pretty tall thing, right? The Washington Monument is quite a few times the size of those flagpoles, right? It's 555 feet tall. It's as tall as 50 stories, or as high as 55 elephants stacked on top of each other. Or maybe you could say it's almost as tall as 2 football fields set up vertically. That's the way you describe and use your imagination to create images in the mind's eye of your listener. Jonathan Swift said it, vision is the art of seeing things invisible. There are no elephants there. There's no football field there. There's no worm. But by using your imagination to invoke those images, you help people see. And Mark Twain, the American humorist, he said it even better. He said, you cannot depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus. I love that. And then here's a final video clip for you. I really like this. It's a very short clip from the recent movie, The Book Thief. And it involves a family during World War II that's hiding a Jewish man in their basement. For all intents and purposes, he's blind with respect to what's going on outside. And the girl in the family is down there working on language with him, and he asks her about what's going on outside. Let's take a listen and a look at this clip.
Tell me, where do you get these words?
It's a secret.
And who would I tell? Can you do me a favor? Can you describe the day for me? What's it like outside?
It's cloudy.
No. Make the words yours. If your eyes could speak, what would they say?
It's a pale day.
Pale. Good, go on.
Everything's stuck behind a cloud. And the sun doesn't look like the sun.
What does it look like?
Like a silver oyster.
Thank you. I saw that.
A 12-year-old girl using her imagination and coming up with an eloquent description, a silver oyster. And, we'll go around in a class and just talk about how many different words can you use to describe someone moving along a sidewalk. Why say walk when you can more vividly describe the action with sashay or stroll, skip, stumble, saunter, and other synonyms that don't begin with an S, right? We become walking thesauri. Or if we're at our computer, we can just have thesaurus.com at the ready, and we're good to go then. Working on crosswords is helpful too. So good describers, you want to be vivid, but you also want to strive for simplicity, succinctness. As I've emphasized, less is more. And I love this quote. In writing a letter to a friend, the 17th century philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal, he said this. He's writing his letter and he said, I've only made this letter longer because I've not had the time to make it shorter. Describers have to take the time. Take the time to make it concise and vivid and use as few words as possible. So you use words that help folks see vividly and even see beyond what's readily apparent, but you maintain objectivity, and I want to emphasize that too as we sum up here. Describers sum up that concept with the acronym WYSI, WYS, WYSIWYZ. And of course that stands for what you see is what you say. Some of you may say, well, wait a second, you just told us to see things that aren't even there. Well, yes, I did. This concept of WYSIWYZ, really is about objectivity. The best audio describer objectively recounts the visual aspects of a film or an exhibition because your qualitative judgment gets in the way. It constitutes a subjective interpretation and is unnecessary and unwanted. We want to let our listeners conjure their own interpretations based on a commentary that is as objective as possible. So if a woman is crying, what do I say? Well, she's crying. Tears are flowing down her cheeks. She must be very sad. Sad. No. Sad. We can't see sad. We can't see angry. We see physical manifestations of those states, and we let the listener determine what that state is. We do that ourselves in our brains in a split second. So be careful. It's not a matter of he's furious, she's upset. No, he's clenching his fist, she's crying. People who are blind, here's what I've learned. Maybe their eyes don't work or don't work so well, but their brains and interpretive skills are intact, and we need to let that be. So we need to remember that it's very natural for us, and we do it again in a split second, to interpret. And we all see things the way we see them, and that's just part of life. Anais Nin said, we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. Just remembering that, I think, will help caution you with respect to making that subjective interpretation. Be as objective as possible and let the listener come up with their own interpretation. And speaking of cartoons, I love this cartoon. It makes this point from Pickles, the old couple, Opal and Earl. They're out in their yard, and Opal says to Earl, "This yard looks like a mess, Earl." Earl says, Henry David Thoreau said, "It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. Me, I see a wild, untamed area of indigenous flora, flourishing and thriving as nature intended." Opal says, "Yeah, and I see a husband who's full of baloney." There you go. Objectivity and interpretation. Finally, whether you as a describer are the one who's going to voice the description or not. Oftentimes with media, there's a describer that writes description, and a voice talent is hired to voice the description. Even that person must understand what description is about, because voicing description is much different than voicing a 30-second commercial or a spot, if you will. So we're building our verbal capability, but the describer also develops the fourth fundamental, vocal skills, through work with speech and oral interpretation fundamentals. We make meaning with our voices. They've done studies that talk about how nonverbal communication carries the weight of a message that's coming across, not the words used. So a quick exercise or two that I use. Here's a phrase for you, a very simple phrase. You can read it out loud yourselves. Woman without her man is a savage. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, perhaps the women in the audience don't agree. Well, if you don't agree, and nobody would agree, I think, but hopefully, if you don't agree, how would you simply say those words aloud? Don't change any words, don't add any words, don't take away any words, and make it mean the opposite. You coming up with it? You coming up with it? How about woman? Oops, I clicked the wrong button. Here it is. Woman, colon. Without her, man is a savage. Just by using oral interpretation fundamentals, inflection, pitch, tone, pause, you create meaning with your voice. And an audio describer in performing arts who's voicing his or her own description must do that, and a voice talent must do that. I've got another one that I think you'll enjoy. This is maybe harder, actually. Here's the phrase. That is that is not. Oh my God, what could that possibly mean? Well, again, with punctuation. Punctuation is simply a method for notating visually what we do with our voice. And of course, our voice and oral interpretation is a way of orally making come alive what is written with punctuation. So here it becomes that is, that is not, is not. And finally, at the end of this little unit, if you will, when I do description training, I talk about the concept of consonants. When description was first being studied and developed, we were so concerned about objectivity that we felt all the voicing should be as monotonic as possible, dry, just like a golf announcer, if you will. Now he's moving there, now he's moving here, now he takes a swing, now he... Well, I think what we've discovered since those days is that the speaker, the voicer, must be in consonance with what's happening on stage, on the screen, in a visual art exhibition, whatever it may be. It's not that you become part of it. No, not at all. You're fading. You should not be a part. You should not be noticed. But the best way to not be noticed is if you blend with it, if your tone is in consonance with what's happening on screen. I dare say it's quite noticeable if something sad is happening and you sound, monotonic, like a robot, or vice versa. No, I think the idea of consonance really can help you verbally, or rather oral interpretation-wise, be able to create meaning for someone who cannot see. With that, I'm going to flash up here my contact information, my own website, audiodescribe.com, and my email address, jsnyder@audiodescribe.com. My book is The Visual Made Verbal, a comprehensive training manual and guide to the history and applications of audio description, and you can get it at amazon.com or thevisualmadeverbal.net, and also at acb.org in their mini mall. And I want to remind you again to take a look at certainly my own website, but the audio description project of the American Council of the Blind, and that's at acb.org/ADP. And I can be reached at ACB as well, at jsnyder@acb.org. So with that, Sharon, I am eager to address any questions if anybody has them, and I'll let you open it up.
That's great, Joel. Thank you so much. And Joel has allowed a lot of time for questions. So this is a great opportunity. Please type it into the chat and, ask your questions. Perhaps if you've got a particular situation that you're working on or your organization is working on, it's a great opportunity to, describe the project you're working on and get advice and input from Joel. So I see there's at least one person typing in questions. If you're interested in asking a question over the phone, you can also, if you're on the phone line, you can press #6 to unmute your line. If you're on voice over IP, just type into the chat area that you want to ask a question verbally, and I can authorize your microphone. So Eliana has a question. So Joel, she asks about how long should it take to properly audio describe a film clip of about 5 minutes? Also, about how much should that cost?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's not really a definitive answer to the first part of the question. I will say that when I had a staff of professional, trained, experienced audio describers, even for them to come up with a first draft, just the first draft of description for a half-hour show would take about a day. And that comes out to about an hour for 3 to 5 minutes of film material. That's a kind of a rough hand tool, if you will, for gauging it. If something is full of dialogue, it may take less time. If there's not dialogue, it'll take more time. And it just depends on the specialties of the describer and how they go about doing their work. Generally speaking, a 5-minute clip, the audio description that's done by large captioning companies that work with audio description companies like mine will generally be farming out work for half-hour shows or hour-long shows, and the costs are by the hour, and that can range anywhere from $950 or $1,000 an hour, program hour, up to $1,500 or even $2,000 per program hour. That should be all inclusive, though. That means the writing, the voicing, the recording, the editing, the layback to the original video, or perhaps just delivery of an audio file, whatever the client wants. For a 5-minute video, you probably see minimums come into play there because some people want to get a per minute rate, and you can put it at 20 minutes of video, but it's hardly worth it to do something. It costs so much more to do it than if you give me a 1-minute video and I charge you $20, I lose a couple of $100. So I would probably charge, my own company would charge, we have a minimum of $350, which I think for what you're getting, it's a little more than what captioning would be, but there's more involved. Obviously, there's original creating of a script and the voicing of it, and we use professional union voice talents trained in audio description techniques and a professional recording studio.
Okay, great. And Eliana said, thanks, very helpful. Presentation, very useful, got my imagination going. So that's great. Okay, Judy asks, when describing the Sesame Street video, would you not mention the bearded man as Robin Williams instead, or any of the other famous people who appear on the show?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and that comes up all the time. And that came up when we were doing that description, of course. Who is your audience? Now, generally, your audience is going to be a heterogeneous audience, one where you don't really know the age range and the demographics of the audience. It's hard to pinpoint things. So audio describers or linguists use kind of by hand, they think of aim for an 8th grade education level. And perhaps that makes a comment on where Americans are at these days. So Sesame Street, we're dealing with 3 to 5-year-olds. Are 3 to 5-year-olds really going to know or care that that's Sheryl Crow or Little Richard or B.B. King or even Robin Williams? That would be describing for the parents, if you will. And the time that it takes to label something, to name something, is time taken away from actually describing it. So in those instances, we decided to go with very brief descriptions instead of the names, because typically 3-year-old, 5-year-old is just not going to know the significance of a Little Richard. That's there for the parents, and it's kind of fun for them to see and get a kick out of, if you will.
Great. Then Donna asks, what if there is a lot of dialogue? How do you make the audio description fit?
Yeah, see, that's a great question because, I talked about the 5-minute and how long does it take to do 5 minutes of description? Well, if the 5 minutes are like that clip from The Color of Paradise, well, on the one hand, you could say, wow, there's so much time there. That's going to take a lot of time to write all that description. Well, Blaise Pascal, of course, said, I haven't had the time to make it shorter, so understanding, it's still a matter of, sure, using as few words as possible, letting the sounds be there, so that's a different kind of challenge than the one that's being proposed here. There's lots of dialogue. Well, you'll be surprised how much an audio describer can convey literally in a half a second, literally in 30 frames. And we actually time our descriptions down to the frames that it takes. We have software that does it, or you can do it manually. You can actually find places. You don't want to cover the dialogue. You don't want to cover the sound of the original soundtrack, generally speaking, although, again, what's most critical to the understanding and appreciation of the piece, hearing someone go, or describing over those sounds. You want to let the critical elements, the critical sound elements, be there for sure. But even if there's just nothing like that, a half second, you can convey, and that takes that's a different challenge. So that can take a lot of time to come up with just the right phrasing, being able to time it precisely. Sometimes we will you don't want to voice over 160 words per minute generally, because you need to let the language sink in, if you will. But sometimes in the studio, they can speed up your voice to an extent that you can't even hear it being speeded up, but it fits in that second or that half a second. It shaves off a few frames, and you won't even notice the difference. Obviously, you're not going to speed up your voice so that you have chipmunks describing to you. That would not be helpful. But on the other hand, on Sunday mornings, I like to perceive, let's say, Meet the Press. Well, I don't necessarily have to watch Meet the Press because it's all talk, right? So I listen to Meet the Press on C-SPAN when it's rebroadcast in the afternoon. So some programs are going to have priority, I think, with respect to description, and others not so much.
Okay, Simon asked the question, instead of designing for something already produced, what advice would you give to someone designing for both visuals and audio description?
Wonderful. And that question brings up all kinds of ideas that are quite wonderful, I think. Audio description, as it was originally conceived, is an add-on. It is a post-production element. Well, there's research being done most prominently at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. I've worked with Deborah Fells there on working with the production of shows that build the description in as you go, if you will. And that can be, in that sense, accessibility can be about aesthetic innovation, actually. There's a theater group in New York City, used to be called Theater by the Blind. Now it's called Theater Breaking Through Barriers. When I first saw them as Theater by the Blind, I thought, well, they're going to have great audio description. Well, they don't have any audio description as we traditionally developed it. No, audio description is so important to them that they want it available at every single performance. And, in performing arts, typically, maybe only 2 performances out of a 6-week run will be audio described or sign interpreted for people who are deaf. So Theater by the Blind would build in a narrator to anything that they produce. Either that, or they would actually write lines of description for the characters to speak. They would find a way to weave the description into the material itself, so that as is being discussed here by Simon, you actually are designing both the visuals and the audio description at the same time. It's not done often enough, actually, but now with the advent of technology and downloads and the web, sometimes you can have description and then click somewhere and get extended description or enhanced description. So that helps as well. But doing it from the get-go, like anything, it's like universal design. It's far less intrusive and far less expensive to design the ramp in the building as you're designing the building rather than adding it on later.
Okay, we have a question from Rutgers. They say, you mentioned it was important not to over-explain so as not to be annoying or patronizing, which I understand. However, what if this is in the context of an educational audio-described tour in a museum or similar setting? Is it okay to be more of a teacher in tone?
Yeah, excellent question again. In museums, my feeling is that many museums have audio tours, which essentially give you background information. They're educational. They assume everybody can see what is being discussed. Fine. And then the museum will be approached by someone who's blind and says, oh, I can't access this, and they'll develop a separate audio described tour. My feeling is when I work with museums to develop these tours, I like to basically have the tour be one one thing that is universally designed and not only makes the images accessible to people who are blind, but enhances the whole experience for people who are sighted. So it can be done carefully and vividly and imaginatively, I think, so you're not annoying people who are sighted and telling them what they can see. People are sighted, as we know, they don't see everything first go around anyway. But I think in a museum in particular, you're going to have text oftentimes. Even in an art museum, there'll be labels that may have several paragraphs. Studies have shown that most people look at the paragraphs longer time than they look at the picture, and then they move on. And that all takes only 15 seconds or something, which is ridiculous. But in any event, the textual material is visual material that needs to be included. So we generally begin with description, weave in the textual material or move it toward the end. And if there's a lot of text or if there's more information that needs to be conveyed, nowadays with digital audio tour players or downloading something to your phone, you can even use your phone to access a layer or a drill down, as we say, which if you want more information about this, press 1, 2, 3, and you get a layer of information. There are, as you all know, there are skimmers, swimmers, and divers, museum attendees who skim everything, others who spend a little more time, they're swimmers. But then there are the divers who will read every scrap and tittle of text, really look at every image. Those folks are in the minority. But if they want to read everything, they should have it accessible to them, and usually that's done by drilling down to a layer or two. So, it depends on what the client needs and what they want. If they want to have the information in there, why not? It becomes a hybrid tour. It may not be strict audio description only for blind people, but why should this be only for blind people anyway? I think a universally designed approach is probably makes the most sense.
Great. Thank you, Joel. Do we have any other questions? I don't see anybody typing in. So it looks like we've got all of our questions. So again, I just want to thank Joel for doing such a great job. Really,
Thanks,
helping to understand the, the art of audio description. So thank you, Joel.
Well, thank you, Sharon.